Along the eastern end of the Himalayan mountains, hundreds of square miles of limestone and disappearing streams produce an ideal environment for deep caves to form. Centered in Southeast Asia, much of this area is almost impassable and untraveled. But in northern Thailand, along its border with Burma, ways of access do exist. In 1983, a group of 9 Americans journeyed to this region to explore and map caves in this virgin territory. Members of this expedition included Bob Benedict, Gene Benedict, Jeb Blakeley, Steve Zeman, and Dino Lowrey, Robert Humperty, Dave Evarts, Rigg, and Mike Ingram. The group assembled for the first time in mid-December of 1983 in San Francisco to complete packing of survey equipment. 2 65-pound packs contained gear for each member of the expedition. When the group departed from the San Francisco airport on the night of December 20th, equipment totaled around 1,100 pounds. After 23 hours of travel, we arrived in Bangkok, a city of 7 million people and an immense ongoing traffic jam, where even crossing the streets was itself a hazardous affair. One of the more interesting features of Thai culture was the Grand Palace, which once was a residence of the king but is now a museum. The palace highlights many centuries of Thai art and architecture. Caves have always been an integral part of Thai life because of the monastic influences from Buddhism, the dominant religious sect. This tapestry found in the Grand Palace depicts a scene in a cave and dates from many centuries ago. The Buddhist religion is an important part of Thai life, as exemplified by this gold Buddha, weighing 5 metric tons and housed in a temple near the Grand Palace. Another prominent temple in the area is called Wat Arun. It shows the architectural style and attention to detail concerning meditative and artistic aspects of the monastic tradition. While in Bangkok, we also studied Thai wildlife that might be encountered. This king cobra's bite can be lethal in a few moments. These animals were found at the Red Cross snake farm, where venom was collected to derive antivenom serum. After a few days of errands and government paperwork, we were ready to journey north. Our destination was the town of Chiang Mai, which is the second most populous city in Thailand. It is a popular tourist destination and is located some 600 kilometers from Bangkok. The Buddhist influence is even stronger in Chiang Mai than further south, with very conservative political and social attitudes. Our lodging in Chiang Mai was in a guest house typical of the area. Here we repacked and organized our gear and planned the details of our studies in coordination with the University of Chiang Mai and provincial government officials. Our first area of investigation was a commercial cave called Chang Dao, some 25 miles from Chiang Mai. The cave itself was 5 miles from the nearest housing, so the headman in the village offered us accommodations in a town hall normally reserved for special ceremonies. At the time, those ceremonies included paying final homage to a recently deceased monk. Because of concerns about malaria-carrying mosquitoes, we pitched tents inside the unscreened building. We were in Chang Dao during the Christian New Year holiday, and children from the area were raising money for local relief operations. Chang Dao is perhaps the most famous commercial cave in Thailand. For a fee of 15 cents, you can enter the cave's first chamber. The cave is partially lighted, and tourists can go further with the assistance of local guides. The cave has an accumulation of religious artifacts representing several hundred years of history. Many people make pilgrimages here to pay their respects to the local monastery and to make offerings to the statues of Buddhas and hermits inside. One of the noted formations in the cave is a carved stalactite called the Sleeping Buddha. The cave is also used socially by members of the village who sell incense and flowers to the pilgrims. This cave is composed of many large rooms, some of which are well decorated. While we were unable to follow the cave's underlying stream to its source, we did map about 2 kilometers during the week we were there. When the cave was mapped as far as possible, we left the village to look for other ways into the Changdao system. This transportation was arranged by Awu, our guide who was to prove invaluable. The area north of the cave is a national park, made so primarily to preserve the wildlife there, especially the exotic butterflies. The road to the Hill Tribe village was only barely passable, despite a week of drying time since the last rain. Landslides of the previous rainy season had only recently been bridged by temporary roads. The land above Changdao is another series of ridge and valley combinations, with no surface drainage and sparse surface streams. The few inhabitants of the area are members of the Lisu Hill Tribe, which conveniently was the tribe of Awu. Their village was perched on the side of a sinkhole. Weather in this part of Thailand is unusual to most Westerners. Temperatures during the day were in the 70s or 80s, with intense sun and few, if any, clouds. But immediately at sunset, the temperature would plummet, and the humidity would rise to a high level, producing dense fog. The fog would not burn off until 9 or 10 the following morning. The locals spent much time together socializing, and we are sure wondering about the strange visitors around them. The people of the village were extremely helpful and friendly. Because they were hunters, they knew the terrain quite well and were able to tell Awu the exact location of many cave openings. The Lisu had even explored the few caves without vertical entrances. The village elders, though stern-looking, were always polite, and unlike the children, did not seem to mind photographs. The women and young girls dress elaborately, though the male children sometimes wear no clothes at all despite the cold. The village has been offered free schools by the Thai government, but has consistently declined, wishing to preserve their traditional way of life. Each of our outings was an event to the villagers. Our study of the caves always started with long hikes and steep, overgrown terrain, accompanied by local guides who would take us through many obscure trail junctions, often in the fog, and over many ridges into distant valleys to check entrances they had seen. Sometimes these pits contained wildlife that ventured into the cave and then could not escape, such as the spiny anteater. Most of the features we checked were mud-plugged, dead-bottomed pits, around 10 to 40 meters deep. Some were more spectacular, being as much as 50 meters deep, and often quite beautiful. Nearly half a dozen caves were investigated in the mountains and valleys near the village. Most of the time, the caves consisted of only entrances, with an occasional interesting formation. It was several days before we discovered any caves of large dimensions. One such cave was a horizontal river cave, about 1.5 kilometers long, with several interesting side passages and an intact human skeleton of recent vintage. The most challenging cave in this area was called Avalapa by the locals, which means pigs play in the mud. This was a most appropriate description since the cave was extremely dirty. It also had high levels of carbon dioxide and low air circulation, in addition to being very hot. The cave had some formations, especially in the upper reaches, but was mostly dominated by muddy fissure passages totaling 150 meters in depth. These passages were intricate and twisting, with mud-coated walls that produced filthy ropes and much mud-encumbered climbing gear. The most significant find in the cave was the skull and most of the skeleton of a large animal. The intact skull and teeth were brought to the surface. Ascending in the cave was difficult because of the high carbon dioxide levels and because of the mud-coated rope. These two items greatly increased the effort needed for even the easiest task. Exploration took 3 trips and resulted in enough muddy equipment to warrant another day to clean up. After we had completed mapping caves in the area, we de-rigged the drops and hauled equipment back to the village. The locals considered the skull a source of magical and medicinal power until they learned it had been handled by women in the survey. It then lost all its value. Camping at the village had been friendly and enjoyable. The Lisu were very tolerant of the disarray we created and were exceedingly honest. We ate outside with rice cooked by the villagers to supplement the freeze-dried food we brought ourselves. Towards the end of our stay, we and several locals purchased a pig to add variety to our diet. The most obnoxious pig from the herd was selected and killed with a single spear thrust into the heart. The pig was sterilized and hair was removed with a large bonfire of dried grass. Butchering was important enough to warrant a celebration. Members of the expedition were invited to participate in the resulting day-long party featuring local delicacies such as pigskin stew, raw pork and spices, and a variety of other food and drink. After 8 days of explorations, we had been unable to find our way into the upper end of the Changdao cave system. We decided to move the expedition operations north to an area visited in 1982 by Bob and Jean Benedict. We returned down the road to the town of Changdao, where Awu made arrangements with local truck drivers who took us to the town of Fang. The markets in Fang were not as elaborate as those in Chiang Mai, but we could still buy Chinese herbal medicines such as deer horn and ginger root. We again found transportation into the mountains along the Burmese border. This time, our destination was a government forestry research station. Known as Ang Khan, it is only a few kilometers from the border with Burma and is an area of political concern to the Thai government. As a result, the road featured several military checkpoints. Similar to other parts of Thailand, the area is a mountainous karst terrain with little surface drainage. This area, though, had a well-developed road and trail system. The villages were mostly built in sinkhole valleys near springs, although the government is encouraging irrigation. We unloaded equipment and established camp across the road from a house where we could store supplies. The kitchen was again outside. Cooking food was always a source of entertainment for the local children. Weather here was similar to that of the Lisu village, with 80-degree days, but freezing fogs at night. Terrain was quite steep and jungle-covered, where it had not been cleared for agriculture. Many caves and sinkholes were obvious. Karst formations often rose directly out of cultivated fields. Because of the more extensive trails and clearing efforts, we were able to find nearly a dozen caves of significant interest in our 3-week stay. By this time, most of the equipment had seen at least some use, and everyone seemed to be adapting to camp life. The sheer amount of equipment, though, had not diminished much. One of the first areas we investigated was inside the grounds of the forestry station itself. These gardens cover hundreds of acres and are elaborately terraced and decorated. They are a popular tourist attraction for people coming from Fang and Chiang Mai for the day. One sinkhole in this area was covered with terraces and led to the opening of a cave known as Dead Robber Cave. This name was the result of the punishment inflicted on thieves in historically recent times. The thief would be thrown to his death down the 64-meter entrance drop. Here the rappel was rigged as a clean and free drop between huge rocks. This led to a boulder pile of immense scale at the bottom. In this cave we found and collected several bats for the experts at the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum. The bottom of the entrance room turned into a mud and water sump about 30 meters below the end of the entrance rope. However, a small passage in the wall nearer the entrance led through an area known as Moosey's Crawl. This opened to a room of immense dimensions, as shown by these 2 carbide lights shining dimly across the chamber. The cave consisted primarily of 2 very large rooms, the first of which was well decorated with massive flowstone formations. Both rooms slope steeply and have a sizable stream running on the floor even in the dry season. The rooms are each at least 100 meters long and 50 meters wide and high. A beach at the bottom end of the first room is large enough to easily throw a frisbee. After a constriction and a rope drop, the cave narrows considerably into a drain complex. Here we found this complex was clogged with flowstone and mud. It finally ended in a low stream passage in the flowstone. Gathering our equipment, we made the return trip to the surface. The village outside the forestry gate provided no lodging, but refreshments and stores for tourists and cave explorers alike. People of the area were ethnically Chinese. Their culture and habits were different also, which included cigarette smoking in large bamboo pipes and long hours spent in the restaurant talking with the other villagers. To the south of our campsite, mountains rose more steeply and the valleys dipped lower. The nearest cave in this direction was only a few kilometers away and was called Dig Cave. It clearly illustrated the evolution of typical caves in this region. The cave openings formed at the contact between two different layers of limestone that sloped at a sharp angle. This produced large triangular passages near the entrance. These passages tapered to fissure canyons and eventual mud or flowstone plugged sumps. Most of the caves had moderate streams and small bat colonies. We continued our exploration by moving to the south and west in a route parallel to the Burmese border and conducted our surface surveys as we went. On the way, we checked potential cave openings in fields and on the edges of jungles. Poppy Sink Cave was one of the more significant finds in this area. Eventually, 3 trips were required to explore it fully. This cave was drier than most and extensively decorated near the top. As with previous explorations, we found it was very vertically oriented. This again meant extensive rope work. Bats were found and collected here too. Like many others, Poppy Sink Cave had mud or silt floors. Every hike took us further up the steep hillsides along the cultivated fields. The deepest we discovered in our expedition was known as Big House Cave and required no rope work at all for its 200-meter depth. It consisted of a large room sloping down to a stream passage, ending in a mud and flowstone plug. Bats collected from our explorations were brought back to camp. Here they were tagged with the appropriate cave name, date, and habitat information before being preserved. Though we were in a friendly village, camp again consisted of sleeping in tents. Washing was via the irrigation hoses provided for the agricultural work there. As our expedition drew to a close, we decided on one more major exploratory trek to look for extensive cave systems. This was done with no wetsuits and a limited amount of rope and vertical gear. It involved about 1 full day's march over roads and trails. Awu led us through the area with occasional stops at village cafes for refreshments and discussions with the locals concerning the possibilities of caves nearby. The latter part of this trip was along steep but well-maintained trail systems. Most of the leads checked on the way did not go far, and often terrain was quite difficult. Eventually, we camped at a Chinese farmer's house far removed from neighbors or villages. As was typical on our trip, the weather consisted of heavy fogs at night, clearing at 9 or 10 a.m. Consequently, most mornings were spent waiting for the sun to strike camp. The farmer who was our host had lived in the area for 12 years, and we were the first tourists, either Western or Asian, that had come here. In fact, his 9-year-old daughter had never seen white people before. Of course, they were still exceedingly friendly and hospitable to strangers. Each morning when the sun would reach camp, we would don cave clothes for our next exploration. Horsehouse Water Cave was the first significant find in this area. This cave descended steeply through some 15 and 20-meter drops to a down-climbing section which opened up into larger canyon passages with many formations and alternate stream courses. Most of the drops in this section were short and dry. Lower down, drops became wetter. The longest drop in the cave, though, was 45 meters and was dry. This large fissure twisted its way down to a canyon passage at the bottom. Here, the opening was about 5 by 10 meters. Its massive size made our surveys fairly easy. There was a significant stream at the bottom, even though this was the dry season. Evidence of extensive flooding was everywhere. The passages in several parts of the upper portion were sloped along bedding planes in a very pronounced manner. The majority of the canyons were vertical, however. Formations were locally extensive, though most of the cave exhibited bare, dry walls. Back at our camp, we decided that 5 weeks of cave exploration were enough. We regrouped and prepared for the hike back to the road. Equipment was dried as much as possible to minimize pack weight, and we made final preparations for the last leg of our expedition. The trip out entailed a walk over ridges and down to the main highway in the valley. Our Chinese host regularly made this round-trip hike in one day, though we took almost 8 hours for this journey. The high mountain vegetation gradually gave way to tropical plants. Near the end of our hike, we reached a dirt road that unfortunately had no traffic going our way. Another few hours, though, brought us to the first town of any size that we had seen in nearly a month. Here we temporarily discarded our packs and took advantage of luxurious cold drinks and curbside seats before the coming days of rest and relaxation at the famous Thai beaches to the south.
Celebration in a town tonight. All day long they've been slaughtering upon the stone. Share out the meat. Yeah, you really like to eat. Come on, woman, come, follow me home. Oh, well, the priest, he cried, Virgin, ascend into the skies tonight. All day long I have passed my time. When the church bell rung, stayed up on the tower in the dying sun. Now come on,